Who welfare was really created for. The hidden history of government housing and food programs. Imagine living in America during the early 1900s. It looked very different than what it looks like today. There was no food stamps, no housing assistance, no government safety net. And if you lost your job, your family relied on churches, neighbors, or charity just to survive. But then something happened that changed America forever. The Great Depression. Banks collapsed. Businesses shut down. Millions of Americans were suddenly hungry and homeless. And that's when the US government began creating the programs that today we call welfare, housing assistance, and food support. But here's the part many people don't know. These programs were not originally created for African Americans. And in many cases, Black families were intentionally excluded for decades. So today, we're going to uncover the real history. Who government assistance was originally created for, how housing and food programs began, and when African Americans were finally allowed to receive them. Before the 1930s, the United States had almost no federal welfare programs. As I mentioned, if someone fell on hard times, they depended on churches, local charities, and family networks. There were poor houses in some cities, but they were harsh and often humiliating. For most Americans, especially Black Americans, survival depended on community, not government. But everything changed in 1929. The stock market crashed, and within a few years, millions lost their jobs, banks collapsed, and entire families became homeless. This period became known as the Great Depression. At its worst, nearly 1 in 4 Americans were unemployed, and this crisis forced the federal government to step in. So in the 1930s, President Franklin D. Roosevelt launched a massive set of programs known as the New Deal. These programs created the first major government subsidies in American history. One early effort was the Subsistence Homesteads program in 1933. It built small communities where struggling workers could receive homes and land to grow food. But the biggest housing program came a few years later. In 1937, the government passed the Housing Act of 1937, creating federal subsidies for public housing for low-income families. This law funded housing projects across America. But there was a major problem. Because of segregation and discriminatory policies, the housing programs were designed for only white families. Also during this era, banks and the federal government used something called redlining. This allowed neighborhoods to be graded based on investment risk. Areas with Black residents were often colored red, meaning banks refused to give mortgages there, which meant many African Americans were locked out of home loans, new suburban housing, and government housing developments. While white families moved into government-supported suburbs and built generational wealth, many Black families were restricted to underfunded urban neighborhoods. This wasn't accidental. It was written into housing policy. In addition to housing, food programs also began during this time. The first version of food stamps appeared during the Great Depression, but the modern system started later. In 1964, Congress passed the Food Stamp Act of 1964, which created the National Food Stamp Program. Today, this program is known as Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP. It helps millions of low-income Americans buy groceries. School meal programs were also introduced earlier. In 1946, the National School Lunch Act created subsidized school lunches for children across the country. Interestingly, one of the reasons for the program was to use up surplus farm food while feeding children. Although these programs technically existed earlier, African Americans did not have access for many years. There were several barriers existed, like segregation laws, discriminatory housing policies, and unequal local administration of programs. Things began to change during the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. One of the most important laws was the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This law banned discrimination in federally funded programs. That meant government assistance programs could no longer legally exclude Black Americans. Housing laws changed further in 1968, with the Housing and Urban Development Act of 1968, which expanded funding for housing programs and urban communities. These changes helped open the door for millions of African Americans to access housing assistance, but it came at a cost of removing Black fathers from the home. In 1974, the government introduced a program many people know today, Section 8 housing vouchers. This program helps low-income families pay rent in private housing by subsidizing part of the cost. Instead of building large public housing projects, the government began helping white families rent homes in the private market. This became one of the largest housing assistance programs in the country. This program furthered segregation by relocating white families to the suburbs and keeping Black families concentrated in red-lined areas. Today, government assistance programs help tens of millions of Americans. These programs include housing assistance, SNAP food benefits, school meals, energy assistance, and medical programs like Medicaid. But debates continue. Some people argue these programs are and were essentially designed for African Americans' handouts. Others argue they should be reduced or reformed. And discussions around who benefits the most continue to spark intense conversations. The history of government assistance in America isn't complicated as society wants you to believe. These programs were created during a time of national crisis to help struggling white Americans. And the reality is, only white families had access from the beginning. Over time, civil rights laws expanded access to include all citizens. Understanding this history helps explain many of the conversations happening today about poverty, housing, and opportunity. Because the story of welfare in America is really a story about who was it designed for and who was left out. Still today, Black families aren't the leading government welfare recipients. If you like this story, please hit the like and subscribe for more content like this.